Hello there. Hello everyone. Welcome on Twitch, YouTube, Discord, and TikTok. Oh, that is covering my face. We are reading Abolition Feminism Now by Angela Y. Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Mayners, and Beth E. Richie. We are still on chapter 1. So let me tell you a little bit about the very ambitious project that I am undertaking, because suddenly I don't have a steady job. Oh, please tap the screen and share the live out. Tappity tap 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 tap. What was I saying? Yeah, my brain is everywhere today. I have borrowed somebody's ADHD today. Did you lend me your ADHD video?
What?
Did you lend me your ADHD?
No, you take everything.
Huh. You didn't even give me tea today.
You made it yourself. You took it.
You mean I took your opportunity at Valor? Yes, I made my own tea today. um, I forgot where I was completely. Oh yes, the thing. Because of the discussions over the past 2 days at this conference, I had an idea about writing about apartheid as a crime against humanity, called Apartheid Never Ended: The Global Architecture of Separation and the Politics of Human Hierarchy. Because it didn't end. So this is the now the planning means that it's possibly going to be up to about 8,000 words. Yeah, I know I should not have. Yeah, it's a. It's an undertaking. But basically, I'm right now writing about the genocide of the Namibian people. Not many people know about the genocide of the Namibian people. Long before apartheid was formalized in South Africa, the territory now known as Namibia became a proving ground for racial domination, territorial segregation, and labor exploitation. Under German rule from 1884 to 1915, what was then called German Southwest Africa witnessed one of the first genocides of the 20th century, a campaign that historians increasingly recognized as the precursor to later systems of racial governance. Between 1904 and 1908, German imperial forces carried out a campaign of extermination against the Herero and Nama people after they resisted land seizures, cattle confiscation, and forced labor. General Lothar von Trotha's extermination order explicitly declared that the Herero were to leave the territory or be killed. Sounds familiar, huh? I think it was somebody who's alive today who said it recently. Was it Smotrich or was it Ben Gvir? I can't remember which one. Survivors were driven into the Omaheka Desert, where thousands died of thirst and starvation. Historians estimate that up to 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama population were killed. This is something that y'all don't learn about in history. Lovey? Love? Can you fill my water bottle, please?
What?
Can you please fill my water bottle?
Where is it?
Here, in my hand.
Okay. From the tap or from down?
From the tap. Scholars such as Jürgen Zimmerer and Isabel Hull have documented how the genocide involved concentration camps, forced labor, racial classification systems, and medical experimentation, practices that would later reappear in European fascist regimes. are currently happening in Palestine. Germany formally recognized the genocide in 2021, though debates over reparations and land restitution remain unresolved. Of course. Did any of you know that? Thank you, my lovely. He's squeaking. What?
Oh, the dying of lights on. I was asleep.
No, I'll go down. So yeah, that is the gist of it. And this is how genocide clears the land, and then colonial settlement reorganizes it. And then thereafter, I think it was World War I, deal? When South Africa assumed administrative control over Namibia.
No. I don't know.
Yeah, I've got to research a little bit more on this, but yeah, it's a classic case of divide and conquer. So yeah, if anybody wants to read it, I don't know where it's going to be published. If it is ever going to be published, I don't have a publisher anymore. So if anybody wants to read it, when it's done, I will gladly send it your way. Or if you know anybody who'd like to, who is a publisher, just let me know. And so, hi Gonzo! I'm sorry, my screen wasn't on Discord. It was on my other stuff. I haven't seen you in such a long time. I'm glad that you're here. So now we get into the book. So last week we went over the relationship between abolition and feminism and why abolition is necessary, etc., etc. We get to part 2 of the first chapter called Abolition, called Crucial Antecedents. And that is on page 53 if you want to follow along. Abolitionist as adjective and identity in the contemporary movement draws profoundly on the 19th century as inspiration. Just as racial slavery was a target of abolition then, a retributive and punishment-focused criminal legal system that has always been structurally inclined towards racist violence is the focus of abolition now. Abolition has also been compared by some to the use of the term revolution, amorphous, shape-shifting, defined only through usage. And I quite like that. That when a language is constantly in flux, it means that people are using it. And people are engaging with it. So when abolition means one thing only, that means, that's then. That was the abolitionist movement against slavery. Now we have the prison abolition movement. Just like I'm arguing that apartheid is ongoing. It is not an event in history. It's not a singular event that happened to South Africans only. It is something that has happened to many, many peoples around the world, just not by name. A range of activists, scholars, and public figures mobilize abolition to describe a wide spectrum of work, including work designed to address the era of racial mass incarceration without putting to rest the entirety of the criminal legal system. While abolition has become a 21st century term defining the standpoint of many radical activists involved in global justice movements, we can learn from a close reading of its use in the 19th century at large. Organizers at the turn of the century understood how difficult it would be to attempt to move away from a prison system that had been made to appear natural and permanent. I need to mark this because I need to go back to it. Just as putting an end to the system of the transatlantic racial slavery once seemed an impossible political goal. Why I want to come back to this? When things are made to appear natural and permanent, you have a very hard time convincing people that it is not. When people argue against communism, they argue for capitalism as a permanent, fixed state of being. That capitalism is the natural order of things. The same was done with apartheid. The same is done with subjugation against the Palestinians. The same is done with violence against Muslim people the world over with this Islamophobia. It is normalized to the point that even the most vile violence against women and girls and gender diverse people, that is gender-based violence, is seen as normal within war. That gender-based violence is part of the spoils of war. Also, keep tapping the screen, y'all. Share the live out as much as you can. Ramadan Kareem. Yes, free Palestine. The natural order of things has been made to seem like it is the job of Black, brown, and indigenous people the world over to be doing manual labor, to be at war with each other, to be constantly fighting for their lives, fighting for our lives. That because that is made so normalized and made to seem like the natural order of things, when war was knocking on Ukraine's door, reporters said things like, "This does not happen to us." It was a sight, like one of the reports said, it was a sight you would expect in the Middle East. It's expected in colonized countries. And that is the normalization and the making permanent of a state of being that is neither natural nor permanent. And the same is done with the prison system. Analogies to the abolition of racial slavery have taken root in prison abolitionist circles, even or perhaps especially in the narrower approaches to ending mass incarceration or in studies of the social death of slavery and the civil death of imprisonment. We attempt here to distinguish between a purely analogical relation between slavery and imprisonment and one that acknowledges a genealogical connection between the two institutions. It is within this context of highlighting the historical influence of the system of slavery with its violent and racialized punishments, manifesting in the development of the convict lease system and the post-slavery penitentiary system in the South, that we trace the past convergences of abolition and feminism within the anti-slavery movement. White women, for example, developed a consciousness of their own collective predicament by comparing the institution of marriage to slavery without attending to the violences perpetrated by their own actions and inactions during slavery. And that I can tell Angela Davis's writing immediately in this. Because when she wrote in Oof, chef's kiss. When she wrote Woman, Race and Class, all those years ago, she was saying the same thing. That when white women compared marriage as a form of slavery, they still didn't acknowledge that slavery was bad. Because it was expected that black people should endure it. That they, as white women, shouldn't have to. That idea in itself, while absolutely vile, the fact that Davis brings it up again and again and again in her work shows how pertinent it is to our current contexts, where we look at white womanhood. Oh, and if anybody caught Facts Still Matters live this morning, well, your guys' morning, whoo, the white women in there were angry when the black and brown women were talking about how white women are the gatekeepers of patriarchy and white supremacy through their form of feminism. They were white womening in the comments, abso-fucking-lutely. But when they say that marriage is like slavery, not only are they acknowledging that slavery is a bad thing to go through, they are acknowledging that it shouldn't happen to people who are considered human. And they did not consider black people as human. They may want to consider the very term feminism as an anglicization of the French feminisme, has its origin within the tradition of utopianism, associated with Charles Fourier, who interpreted the social condition of women as a form of slavery. There are some aspects of the relationship between the anti-slavery and anti-prison movements and the political movements in which they occurred that have yet to be brought into the conversation, which acknowledge the pitfalls and potential of feminism. Of the many inspirations for the work of abolitionists today, one of the most important is a text circulated widely among scholars, lay scholars, and thinkers affiliated with the black movement before it became part of the academic canon in the 1980s. W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward a history of the part which black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. Extra shiny. I'm gonna be shiny. It was published in 1935, a moment of social and political reckoning, much like the one we are experiencing today. Written when there was an opening to new possibilities in the wake of the capitalist crisis, Du Bois's volume on the history of post-slavery radical reconstruction and its demise, not only reframed the period by centralizing black agency in the making of a new democracy, but also invited his contemporary readers to observe the crushing counter-revolutionary force of the property-owning elites. He argued that enslaved persons and free black subjects were instrumental in the abolition of slavery, that slavery was indeed the cause of the Civil War, and that Reconstruction was more than a negation of slavery, and therefore was perceived as a threat by white property holders. His analysis offers a challenge both to historians of the period and for the present, in which he wrote, "These arguments also forecast the following contemporary abolitionist approaches. 1. Taking leadership from those who are most directly impacted so that the work incorporates the perspective of the system's direct targets and not simply their more comfortably situated defenders. 2. Calling for the dismantling of the institutions that are overtly causing social and civil death. 3. Broadening the liberatory agenda to include apparatuses of oppression beyond those that are specifically understood to be carceral, and 4, linking contemporary abolition praxis, or theory plus action and reflection, to questions of racial capitalism. Du Bois not only prefigured the term racial capitalism, the idea that capitalism cannot be understood outside of a relationship to power and race, but, with internationalist lens, he also insisted that abolition was always hinged to challenging capitalism. And that is why we cannot take apart the system of the white supremacist delusion without taking apart capitalism and patriarchy at the same time. That is why we need to fight from all fronts, every single one. And every single one of us has a role to play in that. It just looks different from person to person. We can be unified in our different struggles. Toward the end of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois reflects on the damage wrought by the spread of capitalism in the aftermath of slavery, which became especially apparent with the eruption of World War I. The world wept and is still weeping and blinded with tears and blood. For there begins to rise in America in 1876 a new capitalism and a new enslavement of labor. The war laid bare what Du Bois described as grotesque profits and poverty, plenty and starvation, empire and democracy, staring at each other across world depression. And the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will always and must go back to the basic principle of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867 to 1876. Land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white, under a dictatorship of the proletariat. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. Not Lenin. Guess who stole his ideas from somebody writing in the 1800s? A Depression-era text infused with the vision of what Du Bois referred to as abolition democracy, Black Reconstruction was conceptualized as a history of the present, and more specifically, a description of the historical developments that had produced the Jim Crow era. Sorry, I need a little bit more light here. So I'm sorry if that is a little bit destructive in terms of view, but I need light. Despite its necessary focus on humanizing the black subjects who abolished slavery in remaking democracy. One second. I am so sorry. Despite its necessary focus on humanizing the black subjects who abolished slavery in remaking democracy, Du Bois's work still challenges prevailing assumptions about the project and discipline of history. The theory of history he animates relied neither on teleology, the idea that human history would inevitably lead towards social improvement, nor on theology. It suggested that the arc of the moral universe does not necessarily bend toward justice. Reconstructing democracy required labor and sacrifice. I missed a word here. The labor and sacrifice of many. There should be a "the" there. And the study of its suppression did not simply target Southern planters and those who owned slaves, but also the Northern capitalists who joined with them to consolidate the property interest in whiteness. From a collective reading of Black Reconstruction, we are led to re-examine the post-civil rights era, an era in which the dramatic rightward turn of the prison-building period bears a relationship to the demise of radical Reconstruction. That relationship has been described analogically as a period that is something like this, leading Reverend William Barber, for example, in 2013, to call for the third reconstruction that would build on the first one in the 19th century and the 20th, and the second in the 20th, the modern civil rights era. And here we have poster by Singh. Any questions so far? So what we have here is the antecedent to what we see now as abolition of the prison industrial complex. And of course, they're both closely related because the prison industrial complex is a follow-on from the system of slavery. It was made to be this natural progression. So if we can't own slaves, we will own prisoners. We will own their bodies and they will not have rights. They will not have access to recourse because they have forfeited their right to everything that non-enslaved people were given. And that included the right to vote. And so we get to page 59, Radical Reconstructions, Not Liberal Reforms. And I'm really glad that Davis was part of this writing because, yes, she supported Biden and Harris in their 2020 election campaign. 2016, geez. Their 2020 election campaign. And rightfully so. Because when you have a two-party system, the only thing you can do is vote for the lesser of the two evils. I don't think that she knew what a Zionist Biden was. And people accused her of becoming liberal, of becoming soft, of not being radical enough. She's still a motherfucking radical. I can tell you that. Contemporary abolition feminists are pursuing a radical reconstruction. Prison abolitionists and scholars have been inspired by Du Bois's revised perspective, as well as the need to move away from a narrow focus on cages and armed humans to a larger emancipatory vision encompassing all aspects of society. Now, Du Bois, having written this, most of his writing in the emancipation toward sharecropping era, he looked at how the systems worked then and saw the problems with capitalism. Yes, some of his theories about the way black people needed to behave in the presence of the white man is quite alarming, but not surprising for the time. But it really is a case of you take what matters the most to your current context, and that's how you read historical works. But Du Bois is not a historical work. It is still relevant. Terrifyingly so. It was partly black reconstruction that allowed us to begin and see incarceration as on a continuum with racial slavery, rather than belonging to a new and separate era of freedom. It is not enough to release people from chains. Just as Du Bois challenged the notion that slavery could be expunged as a discrete institution, leaving intact existing and political economic frameworks, Abolitionists today call into question the prevailing assumption that mass incarceration can be effectively addressed without analyzing the root causes of injustice and the impact of other systems of oppression, including, in the first place, global capitalism. Anything for profit is political. And I would say nothing. None of these systems work in isolation. None of these systems have ever worked in isolation. It is not enough to release people from their chains. If there's a person who is chained and there are lions roaming nearby, removing their chains only gives them the opportunity to run from the lion. It doesn't take the lion away. Now look at the lion like the system. Whew. I need to write something on this, actually. The overarching question posed by contemporary abolitionists: what would we have to change in our existing societies in order to render them less dependent on punitive security that is associated with carceral approaches to justice? It's a reformulation of a central question that was posed by Du Bois. He asked how society can be reshaped to incorporate formerly enslaved people, providing them with access to land, education, and political power. Just as former slaves needed land or economic power, education or intellectual power, and representation in government or political power, incarcerated communities will be released from the hold of carcerality only by acquiring access to economic, intellectual, and political power. This framework resonates for abolition feminists because to render prisons and policing obsolete, we must also build movements demanding that society be reshaped with the goal of eliminating gender and sexual violence and their enabling of racist and heteropatriarchal structures. Yee. Because the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution condoned the enslavement of persons lawfully convicted of criminal acts, contemporary criminal legal movements persistently center an analogy: slavery on a different scale, linked to the project and regime of the prison. Analogies can be helpful. Prison legal news editor Paul Wright wrote in 1998 an article entitled "Slaves of the State." That effect of the 13th Amendment was not to abolish slavery, but to limit it to those who had been convicted of a crime. And why do you think Black and brown people are disproportionately arrested? Because they want to find them guilty, or they want to execute them. The police are white supremacy wrapped in blue, to protect and serve white supremacy. The idea that imprisoned persons are slaves of the state circulated among Black people in prison long before scholar activists began to probe the relation between slavery and the contemporary punishment system in the U.S. That helicopter is fucking loud. And I can guarantee you, the only reason that helicopter is doing the rounds is because something happened with the rich person. Bad pet helicopter. The notion helped to generate important movements in prisons, especially those calling for union wages and benefits for workers in prison. This analogy continues to surface with effect in Ava DuVernay's film 13th. Brian Stevenson states that there are currently more black men in prison than there were black men enslaved in 1850. A point also emphatically made in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. The revelatory value of the statistical drama notwithstanding, historical methods are overly reliant on analogical reasoning, sometimes is like that something is like something else, and is often misleading. Relying on analogies often erases the imperative to do analytical work that might be more effectively accomplished by establishing the genealogical relation between the institution of slavery and the institution of prison. So we can't just say that imprisonment is slavery, is modern day slavery, because there is still slavery, as in people doing forced labor under duress, people being trafficked for labor. The largest form of human trafficking for labor being sex trafficking. So, yes, slavery still exists. And if anybody tells me that the transatlantic slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade was not human trafficking, miss me with that shit. The current prison system is a follow-on, is a capitalist follow-on from the capitalist system of enslavement, human trafficking, and enslavement. So there's a through line. Did I make you think they're Jaguar? So, Robert Perkinson's Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire, explores the way regimes and punishments associated with slavery made their way into post-Civil War penitentiary systems in Texas and other southern states, thus problematizing the widespread assumption that penitentiaries in Pennsylvania and New York constituted the only important paradigms in U.S. prison history. Complicating the landscape, the terms slavery, modern slavery, and abolition are deployed in contemporary movements that argue for its increased investment in carcerality, specifically to curtail trafficking, particularly sex trafficking and sex work. For example, one global anti-sex trafficking organization, Polaris, named for the North Star, which people held while in slavery in the U.S., used as a guide to navigate their way to freedom. Why? Why do they take something that means so much to our people and turn it against us? In Indian culture as well, Jaguar. They steal everything. They steal fucking everything, wallah. This is further convoluted as often campaigns and legislation that purport to only eliminate sex trafficking, for example, the US 2018 foster and sister laws, are used to police and punish domestic sex work, not trafficking. They don't combat trafficking. Because evidently, the ones doing the trafficking are the ones in power. We are therefore always careful to distinguish anti-prison and anti-police abolitionism from the deployment of the concept of abolitionism to target sex workers. Beyond the slipperiness of analogies, the power of anti-prison organizing also propelled distorted conceptions into the mainstream. Without undermining the undeniable power and influence of texts such as Alexander's The New Jim Crow and Duvernay's 13th, which shares Alexander's conceptualization of history. A close reading and reviewing reveals that both book and film frame mass incarceration as a primarily US problem that emanates from the failure to comprehensively address the economic, political, and cultural consequences of the defunct system of chattel slavery inside the US. While both Alexander and Duvernay associate themselves with current abolitionist discourse and recognize the importance of situating the analysis of the prison crisis within a global framework, those who do not share this broader vision have often interpreted both works to mean that the problem of racialized imprisonment will be solved by conventional and domestic civil rights activism. In other words, without necessarily disturbing larger global frameworks of power such as capitalism and a heteropatriarchy. And I would also say the white supremacist delusion. Are you going to go downstairs again, lovey? Oh, you're not there. Hello. While the term mass incarceration plays a significant role in the awakening of the public to the fact that the US incarcerates more people, both absolutely and per capita, than any other country in the world, its usage as the concept in governmental circles, both progressive and conservative, has inevitably encouraged the assumption that the decarceration of specific populations is, by itself, an adequate response. Similarly, the use of the category of innocence is often revoked as an adequate measure of determining who gets released and who deserves to remain in prison. You going down? Not. Okay. I wanted more tea. That's problematic in itself. That is really problematic. Official reactions assume that the problem of mass incarceration can be addressed by simply releasing a certain number of people from prison, and that the problem of gender violence can be solved by simply imprisoning individual perpetrators, especially prominent male figures. Me Too did not fix anything. And that is what I tried to argue in my thesis. Yet the demonstrations and uprising in the spring of 2020, with demands to defund the police, demonstrated not only that many years of developing abolitionist organizing strategies were finally having a major impact, but that reform pathways, for example, federal legislation like the First Step Act, which opened up potential pathways for releasing a limited number of people from the federal system, cannot even begin to address the structural character of carceral racism. Me Too. The hashtag Me Too. While galvanizing wider audiences, and it really did, These analogies, concepts, and texts often propelled and naturalized reforms that did not disturb the conditions of structural racism that were responsible for the police abuse and incarceration of so many people of color. The First Step Act, as a salient example, was greeted with resounding ovations from liberal and conservative circles when it was finally signed into law at the end of 2018. Hailed as the most significant criminal justice reform bill in decades, some expressed the hope that it might serve as a step forward. Granted, a few more people in federal prisons were released earlier than previously expected, but the overall impact on the incarcerated population, people in state prisons, counties, city jails, jails in Indian country, immigrant detention facilities, military prisons, and federal prisons will be minimal. The federal prison population of 181,000 people consists less than 10% of the total number of people behind bars in the United States. Wow. If the 2020 occupant of the office of the president had pardoned all of those incarcerated in federal prisons, it would have simply decreased the country's imprisoned population from 2.1 million to 1.9 million. Legislation such as the First Step Act and its relatively minor measures have been embraced as important solutions to the problem, included under the large category of mass incarceration, which is, unfortunately, most often interpreted in isolation from police expansion. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, fuck ICE, and the expansion of public registries, the family policing system, and other dimensions of the prison industrial complex. The rich and extensive history of abolition feminism from the late 20th century to the present militates against simplistic approaches to the issues related to prison, police, and gender violence. It is therefore especially disheartening, although unsurprising to abolition feminists, to witness the overly simplified strategy designed to address the continuing crisis that has been named mass incarceration, and especially to consider the most prominent mainstream approaches to gender and sexual violence rely precisely on carceral solutions. We know that the very history of the prison system has been one of punitive reform, which have carefully safeguarded the system itself from the kind of criticism that not only might have assisted in developing new strategies for addressing harm, but recognized that it is impossible to productively address modes of punishment without deep analysis of the socioeconomic and ideological factors that structure the societies and that prisons purport to serve. It does not address the problem. As abolitionist theory and practice demand a focus on structural forces, this attention cannot come to a standstill once we point out that these structural forces are deeply embedded in the prison industrial complex. What, for instance, is the relationship between the massive numbers of Black, Indigenous, and Latine people behind bars and the system of racial capitalism more broadly? The posing of such a question warns us about the pitfall of assuming that racism is simply a given and, by itself, a foundational, explanatory concept needing no further examination. Whew. Such a truncated and analytical sequence leads, for example, to the fallacious assumptions that what is often referred to as mass incarceration driven by racism is a peculiarly US phenomenon, even as we witness similar developments under the pressure of global capitalism in countries like South Africa, Colombia, and Brazil. A myopic focus on the institution of the prison has protected the institution itself from abolitionist criticism. But it is not enough to focus on abolition in the narrow sense. Indeed, abolitionists have come to recognize that our advocacy must identify much more than the institution itself as a site for abolition. It's simply not possible to tear down prisons but leave everything else intact, including the structural racism that links prison to the larger society, or the heteropatriarchy and transphobia that fuels gender and sexual violence. This is the abiding message that Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America conveys to activists and intellectuals in the 21st century, as prisons and policing continue to constitute the afterlife of slavery. And that is where I will stop for today. Any questions? This is stuff that I've been saying on this app for years. It is not enough to take down one system without taking down the others that it supports and that supports it. These writers just say it better than I do. And with a much larger platform. Do remember that I do these readings for free, so if you can, please donate to my tip goal for today. As always, it is 90 every day. And yeah, losing 2 jobs in 2 months is not fun. So please help. Help, please. So yeah, my PayPal links and coffee links and all of that stuff is in my link tree. Yeah. Please remember to drink water, take your meds, eat something. Remember to smash the motherfucking patriarchy, eat all the white men, and remember to be kind to yourselves, because everybody deserves kindness, including you. And I shall see y'all on Twitch and YouTube on Tuesday, when we are continuing reading this book here, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, the one that makes all of the YouTube listeners and viewers very, very angry as they pick apart things like my acne and weight, because they don't have an argument against the book. So yeah, I'm looking at you, white boys. I hope you step on Lego. The rest of you, I shall see y'all on Tuesday. Tiki-taki, I'm going to stay with you for a minute more. And, yeah.